Hi, I'm Nell from Saturday Morning Cosplay and welcome to my first video tutorial on sewing and stuff. So I'm going to start working on my Daenerys Targaryen costume from season 3 of Game of Thrones. And it's a deceptively simple costume. When you get close up to it, you see that there's a lot of embroidery and stuff that's going on. And one of the most unique things I think about that costume is the smocking that goes on it. And I had never heard of smocking before, so I did a lot of research and I'm going to walk you through how smocking is done. First, what you need is your pattern. This is the pattern that I made. My cat's got to it and it's all ripped now. But the important part to see is this. So what those kind of sort of geometric lines are, that grid and those lines are what you follow in order to make your smocking pattern. I got my information from a website that had really good instructions on the different embroidery techniques that went into a lot of the Game of Thrones costumes, and I'll put a link to her website below. I think everyone should really check it out. It's a wealth of information and it was really helpful in creating this pattern. So what you're going to need to smock, if that's a verb or whatever, your pattern, rulers, just one will do, but I like rulers, your fabric, of course, and needle and thread. See my needle. So you're not really going to see the thread once everything is done, but I still like to pick a thread that's sort of close to the fabric that I'm using, just in case anything pops through, so it doesn't detract and take the eye away from the prettiness of your costume. Now this is a little practice swatch that I've done of what the smocking will look like once you've completed it. Now, you can get up close. It looks like little arrowheads. Oh, then it would look like arrowheads. And this is what the back looks like. The actual finished product will be ironed. Forgot to mention, but you'll need an iron. So that was my little practice square. Then I did some practice on muslin that I cut out to fit my pattern. And that's this piece. And nope, wrong side. I always forget which way it goes. Once you do it for real, it'll be a lot easier to figure out which side is which. Oh, I had it right. So it comes down like that. It could be a little hard to see, but I went a little overboard. I'm not going to do this many on my actual piece, but that's the start of it, and you see the smocking gives a little more structure to the fabric, so it helps the shoulders stick out the way that it's going to need to for the costume. Now you will get your fabric, and you might want to iron it out a little bit if it has a lot of really big and noticeable creases, because it will make your smocking that much harder to do. I'm a bit lazy, and this fabric is not so bad in the wrinkle department, so I'm not going to iron it. And I forgot to mention before, but you're going to need something to mark your pattern, your smocking pattern, onto your fabric. If you're going to use a pen like I'm using, check first and make sure that your ink is not going to bleed through to the other side of your fabric, because that will be a disaster and it will look terrible. So let's cut our fabric. Alrighty, so I ended up having to iron my fabric because I had way worse creases than I thought I did. So now that's done, I laid out my pattern and I pinned it down because I'm using my weights to keep the fabric actually on the table. Now when you go to cut this out, leave yourself a pretty decent seam allowance. I always go way overboard in the seam allowance because it's a terrible fear of mine that I will cut too small and then not fit into my costume and run out of fabric and not be able to finish, and terrible nightmares I have. So now we're ready to cut. Alrighty, so here is the piece. The fabric's cut out. I left the pattern on top so we can take a closer look at how the pattern actually works. Now, it doesn't really look like it would work. Kind of looks like a bulbous mess. But this is the sample piece that I showed you before, and I'm going to line it up with the pattern. And I cut this piece of muslin off of this same exact pattern, and this is what happens. You line up the bottom. I didn't cut the same seam allowance out of the muslin as I did the blue because I had no intention of ever sewing this to anything else. And you can see where the pattern is, where the muslin is, and where my linen is. Everything down here is pretty copacetic, matches up really well. Now what happens is where you get up to where the smocking is, it goes all wonky. Here's the pattern for this actual smocking. Here is the back side of my smocked muslin. What the smocking does, it greatly reduces the width of your fabric once you're done. And to not as great as an extent, it reduces the length. It reduces your width of fabric by 50%, while the reduction in length, I would say, is about 25%. So when you look at your completed and completely smocked piece, you see it's completely off the rails and a lot smaller than what you started with. That's just how smocking works. And when you do your pattern, you have to make sure to take that into account. Now, if you're new to making patterns or you're not 100% comfortable with it, before removing your pattern, it's a good idea to mark onto your fabric approximately where your smocking pattern will have to begin and end for each section. So just fold the paper back, make a quick little mark, and these will be a big help later on when you start actually drawing out your grid. And a little bit about the grid. In a lot of information you'll find about smocking, it will tell you to make a 1 inch by 1 inch square grid. So that means each of these little squares that you probably can't see right now, but I'll show you later, each of those would be 1 inch by 1 inch. That would not work for this particular application, just because your little arrowheads would be way too big and it wouldn't look right in such a small part of the body. If you wanted to use smocking on some other project of yours, knock yourself out and do whatever you want, because it's your stuff. But in this case, the 1/2 inch square grid works the best, and it gives you the exact size of arrowheads as you need. And when you're marking off where your grid is on your fabric, make sure you do it dark enough so you can actually see it, and you don't have to go back and do it again like I'm doing right now, because that's just silly. Okay. Now we will only need our pattern for reference of our smocking. And of course, you're doing all of this on the wrong side of your fabric. You don't want to see any of the thread, any of your markings on the right side. Everything stays on the wrong side, and it'll be pretty and awesome when you're done. So now, we're going to start on what's going to be the little cap sleeve shoulder part of your costume. And you match up your little reference marks, if you can see them. Hopefully you can. And draw a line with your ruler, connecting them. Make sure to double check that your ink isn't bleeding through. If you use chalk, that'd probably be better. I just couldn't find any of mine today, of course. And you're gonna continue down. Let me do this so you can see it. Continue making these lines at 1/2 inch increments until you meet your second set of reference lines. I feel that every single time I do this, I've done several practice pieces. I feel every time I do this, I always decide, let me just throw one more in there. Let's see what happens. When it comes to your grid, I don't think you can have too much. But just make sure that you don't go crazy and way overboard and confuse yourself, since this particular project has 3 distinct sections of smocking. It's not going to be one consistent grid all the way through the piece of fabric. You're going to need to have 3 patches of grid because each section of smocking needs to fit the body in a certain way. So they're all in slightly different ways in order for it to look the best on. I did, your actual smocking pattern will not necessarily be square. And when I say that, I mean you might have 2 rows at one end and it might taper down to one end. You might start with 4 like in the middle section and it'll taper down and you'll have 3 and then 2, and you might want to continue it down further onto the chest and have maybe 1 row of the smocking, so you won't have these perfectly symmetrical grids once you're done. So now I don't know if you can see that, but that's my grid for the shoulder. And I think you should be able to see it. Okay. Now I'm going to continue the rest of the grids. Alrighty, so my grid is now on the fabric, and you can see what I was talking about before, how the grids don't always line up with each other, and that's perfectly fine. It should be that way. Now quickly, these little arrows, that is where the smocking is going to happen. The grid lines are just to keep you going straight and keeping everything even, just to make it look pretty. These are the really important parts. I'll show you more closely when I start actually smocking on the fabric, but basically these lines are showing you where the thread is going. When I first did this pattern, even though I reminded myself not to, I put it on upside down. You want your arrows to look like this when you are looking at your pattern from the bottom up. So if you look the way it would be on you, head on, so that when people see you in it, all your arrows, the points are facing down. Now, this is just the grid. It's time to put your little arrowheads on. And you want them facing up. So you just make a little triangle. By drawing 2 diagonal lines in boxes. Okay? And you do that for every other set of grid marks. So you do the next one here. Now, these don't have to be perfect. They're just to tell you where you're going to be doing your smocking, the important thing, the thing that needs to be kind of precise, is when you're actually physically doing the smocking, just making sure you're picking up the corners of these boxes, because those are the parts of it that you're going to see and that need to be even. And that's why you have the grid. Everything lines up. Keep going. Every other, when you do your next row of arrowheads, you stagger them. So 2 arrowheads will never be directly next to each other. They'll always be staggered. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Now, come over here. So, just continue making your little arrowheads, staggering the pattern, skipping a space. And of course, because of this, every other row is going to match up and be exactly the same all the way up. It's time to actually start what brought us to this video today, and that is smocking. Smocking takes a lot of thread. A lot. However, as annoying as it's going to be, you have to constantly refill your needle. It's easier to refill your needle than to be pulling knots out of it every 2 minutes, because that be's annoying. That is what your grid looks like once you put in all of your markings for your smocking pattern. And there are tons of different smocking patterns, but this is the one that was used for this particular costume, and that's the one I will be using. This is where you use your little triangles. Some people might use dots, but once you get going, at least for me, I get kind of tunnel vision, and it's harder to follow the dots and make sure that everything lines up and is where it's supposed to be than if I have the triangles here, because those triangles, it's very hard to mess that up. It's very clear what needs to happen, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. So you take your knotted thread, you pick up one end of your triangle. And you're just going to secure that stitch. Now, pick a side. I usually go top first. Just drop a little stitch in it. Go to the other corner of your triangle. Drop a stitch in it. Now you're going to complete your triangle by coming back to the beginning. Put your stitch in. So now your thread is in a triangle. And what you do, you pull it tight. And you get a little bunch. Now sew your 3 little pieces together a couple of times to make sure that your bunch doesn't come out or get loose. I don't mind Drogo. He's just overseeing this and making sure that, you know, the smocking doesn't bite me or something. I don't know. But he's looking pretty stern. So now, that's what you get, a little pucker. You're still skipping that space, but what you're doing is you're going to the base of your next triangle, and you're gonna drop a stitch in there, but you're not gonna tighten it like you did your last one. What you do instead is you put a knot in. Do that a couple of times. The way I put my knots in is I put the stitch in, and I bring my needle through the loop of thread that has yet to go through the fabric. And when you pull it, you get a little knot. So now your thread itself has skipped a space. And now you start all over again with your 3 points of your triangle. And when you check the front, you see little arrows. And that is the end of the first row. Let's snip it off. So I'm gonna do some more, and then it's gonna be like a cooking show. I'll be back with a finished piece. Now, if you're still a little uncomfortable with smocking, because if you're anything like me, you never heard of it before, check out Michelle Carragher's website. She has illustrations and shows you how to do this particular smocking pattern. And if you need a little more reference, this is a great book. Reader's Digest, New Complete Guide to Sewing. It discusses smocking, and it gives you a little more visuals, and it helps you figure that out. Also check out Debbie Shore's videos on smocking. She does a really good job of explaining and taking you through step by step. And if you wanted to attempt to make your own pattern, this book is a great help. The Pattern Making Primer by Joe Barnfield and Andrew Richards. And it takes you through the mechanics of patterns, and if you're having trouble figuring out how to do yours, it will be a great help to you. So I finished smocking the left side of my Daenerys bodice, and this is what it looks like. It's kind of like flimsy and doesn't look like much right now, but so you can kind of see what it will look like once it's all done. And keep in mind, I have huge seam allowances here. I think I use about a 1/2 inch all the way around. So I have some excess that I'm going to have to trim away, hem, and all that stuff. But it's better to have more than not enough. And the piece, like in her dress, comes around to the back. It's just a big hole in the back of the dress, so that will be there. The little shoulder sits up. This fabric isn't as stiff as the muslin that I use for practice, so I'm 98% sure that I'm gonna line it once I have everything done, and that will give it a little more body once I'm ready to start putting the garment together. And that is about it. That was smocking. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments and I will help you as much as I can. If I can't help you, I will try to guide you towards someone or something that can help you. And let me know if you want to see more videos and see what else I'm working on. If I didn't mention it before, but this is going to debut at KatsuCon 2014. It's going to be my first KatsuCon, so I'm really excited. And if you're going to be there, let me know. Don't forget, check me out at Saturday Morning Cosplay on Facebook. And I'm Nell. Thanks for coming by.